Hey everybody, in the video I published yesterday, I mentioned that Paul was not the author of 1 Timothy, and this caught some folks by surprise. But the majority of scholars don't think that Paul was the author of 1 or 2 Timothy or Titus. That's all of the pastoral epistles. The majority of scholars believe that those epistles were written decades after Paul's death, at the end of the 1st century CE or the beginning of the 2nd century CE. And there are a number of considerations that lead in the direction of this conclusion. For instance, the language across the three epistles is pretty consistent within the pastoral epistles, but differs wildly from the language used by Paul in what are considered the genuine Pauline epistles. And that language overlaps most closely with the language of Hellenistic literature that was composed at the end of the 1st century CE and the beginning of the 2nd century CE. We also have themes that are very different in the pastoral epistles. For instance, the references to Gnosticism don't make any sense in the middle of the 1st century CE. They make a lot more sense at the end of the 1st century or the beginning of the 2nd century CE. The way the Christian institution is referred to in the epistles also sounds like an institution that has had a few decades to mature and develop. We have references to offices that are not referred to anywhere in the genuine Pauline epistles. We also have some external evidence. Some of our earliest manuscript witnesses to the Pauline epistles and to the New Testament as a whole omit the pastoral epistles, such as Codex Vaticanus, Chester Beatty's P46. The themes that do overlap between the pastoral epistles and the genuine Pauline epistles are treated very differently across those two different corpora. For instance, the discussion of the body, the discussion of faith, the discussion of resurrection, the discussion of the role of women in the church are very different in the pastoral epistles from how Paul discusses them in the other epistles. Now, obviously, there are going to be objections to the scholarly consensus, and there are two main types. And the first is the more fallacious of the two types, and that is the notion that this doesn't definitively prove that Paul was not the author of the pastoral epistles. But you can't really definitively prove much of anything at all regarding the interpretation or the authorship of ancient texts. All we're doing is weighing probabilities to try to figure out which is more likely. Additionally, saying, well, you can't prove that tacitly is suggesting that if it cannot be definitively proven, then we just default to accepting traditional authorship, which is also not how this works. Now, the other argument is this or that consideration or this or that piece of evidence has convinced somebody that it seems more likely that Paul was the author than that he was not the author. And there are arguments that have been leveled against the scholarly consensus, but none of those arguments have convinced the majority of scholars. They are largely the rationalizations that scholars have come up with for why they should be able to maintain their position, which is largely based on dogma. And so the objections are going to be rooted primarily in dogmatism, and the concerns that they raise are not going to be particularly strong and obviously have not convinced the majority of scholars. Now, when it comes to the pastoral epistles, the most parsimonious conclusion, the conclusion that is supported by the preponderance of evidence, and the conclusion that is supported by the majority of scholars, is that Paul was not the author of the pastoral epistles. And if you'd like more information on this consensus and on the reason for it, you can check out my videos number McClellan 1161 and McClellan 1335.